Okay, I think slowly we can get started. I think we're all more or less here. And so good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us for our fourth lecture for our Kuma International Architecture Month 2021. This is our third architecture program. And of course, as you all know, this year's theme is Living Borders, dialogue between Bosnia Herzegovina and Palestine. And so we have, with me here today, of course, is Claudia Zini, the director of Kuma, and we have our guest as well, whom I'm going to introduce in just a second. So just before we get started, a short reminder that this is, again, like I said, fourth lecture. And before last week, we had Haris Piplash and Nadia Habash with us, and they were kind of covering the topics of transforming borders, and we got kind of like the large context, both in terms of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Palestine. We're looking at borders in geopolitics in both spaces. And then this week, we're talking about invisible borders. And so on Tuesday, we had Senada Demirovic Habibia talking about Mostar, a divided city. And then tonight, we have another very special guest, of course, with us. It's Dr. Anwar Jaber, and she will be talking about spatial investigation, the political national topography of Ramallah, Palestine. So just a little bit about our speaker. So Anwar Jaber is an adjunct professor and the AMDT Global Talent Postdoc Fellow at the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo, which is my alma mater university. She's an architect and urban scholar interested in the cultural and socio-political aspects of architecture and urbanism. Her interdisciplinary research explores the meaning and change of the urban environment in cities facing extreme conditions, such as violent conflicts and war. And as a Jerusalem-born and raised Palestinian, Anwar brings an international academic and professional experience from the Middle East, Europe, and Canada. She practiced as a licensed architect and urban planner in Jerusalem and worked as a professor at the University of Waterloo and the University of Toronto in Canada. She also supervised architectural courses at the University of Cambridge in England. So Anwar completed her bachelor's degree in architectural engineering from Birzeit University in Palestine, and she holds a master's in architecture and urban studies and a PhD from the University of Cambridge in England. Her research interests include the interplay between politics and architecture, cities and conflict, urban memory and war, Islamic architecture and urbanism in the Middle East and North Africa, and of course, especially in Palestine and Israel. In addition, she co-edited Scroope 25, the Cambridge Architecture Journal, and served as an editor for the Arab Urbanism Magazine in both Arabic and English. So a very impressive CV, and I'm really pleased and happy that Anwar has taken the time to join us and to be part of this program of our Architecture Month, Kuma Architecture Month 2021. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Anwar, and she will be talking about spatial investigation, the political national topography of Ramallah, Palestine. Anwar, the floor is yours. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Laila, for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be part of this series. I'll start by sharing my screen. Can you see it? Yeah, okay, great. So, okay, so again, thank you very much for having me. I was kind of like thrilled when I received the invitation to join because I've been teaching about Sarajevo in my own courses here at Waterloo and at Toronto, and it's just amazing to be reached out by professionals and colleagues from there. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to more collaborations beyond this presentation for sure. So thank you, Laila, for the introduction. I actually had a slide where I introduced myself. Wait, this is, yeah, okay. So I'm not gonna go through that. It's just, I think it's just important to mention that I was trained as an architect. So a lot of my thinking and my research, it is interdisciplinary, but it's rooted in architecture and urbanism. And I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So that's me professionally, but it's on a personal level, as also Alia said. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, particularly in the eastern part of the city. I grew up Palestinian there, and then I completed my undergrad in architectural engineering at the University of Birzeit in Ramallah, which in here on the map, can you see my cursor?
Yes, you can see it.
Okay, so I studied architectural engineering at Birzeit University, which is on the edges of the city of Ramallah. And you could see the two cities here on the map. They're very close, almost, I would say, 20 kilometers away from each other, probably a little bit less, a little bit more. But there is a checkpoint in the middle. So Ramallah is Palestinian, Jerusalem is under total Israeli control. So there is a checkpoint in the middle, and the checkpoint that is in the middle, oops, I apologize for the imaging here. The checkpoint that is in the middle is actually called Kalandia checkpoint. And that's what I used to cross almost on a daily basis. And you could cross this checkpoint either on foot or by car, or you could still be on foot, but there would be clashes between the Israeli soldiers and the Palestinians. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because a lot of my background and as a Palestinian who grew up in a Palestinian context, but also as a Palestinian who grew up particularly in Jerusalem, a lot of that shaped my research interests and my research. And I'll be happy to expand more on this methodologically, maybe in the Q&A session. But yeah, it's a lot of my research interest actually stems from my personal background. So I'm not going to go through all of this. I had prepared slides for going through, the history of the Palestine and, what happened, how we ended up to the situation that we are in today in Palestine. I'm not going to go through all of that because, I'm assuming that in a series that particularly addresses Palestine, I'm kind of like assuming that the audience knows about this. But again, if you also want me to expand on this, I'll be happy to do that in the Q&A. But I think it's important to highlight that architecture and urbanism are key important tools when we're trying to understand the context of Palestine and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And over the years, the Palestinian space was shrinking and the Israeli space was always expanding. And from zoning and urban planning to the actual construction of physical structures, a lot of aspects of architecture of architecture and urbanism actually were part and parcel of the dynamics in the context of Palestine and Israel. So again, I'm not going to go through all of that in details, and I would like to start by introducing my own research on the city of Ramallah in Palestine. This research is actually my PhD research, which I completed at the University of Cambridge in England 2 years ago. And it's also on the city of Ramallah, where I completed my undergraduate degree. So whenever I talk about Palestine, or whenever I currently in my teaching, when I bring up the issue of Palestine, Israel, my students usually go to Google Maps and they try to understand where is Palestine. And a lot of them will come back to me saying, you know what, we don't know where Palestine is because Google Maps does not tell us anything. And when we talk about Palestinian cities, I think it's important to try to position ourselves spatially in the maps. So what we refer, or what is under Palestinian administration right now, is actually Gaza Strip that you see in here, and the West Bank, which is this bean-shaped figure in here. And in this West Bank, you could see Palestinian cities such as Hebron, Bethlehem. What should be Palestinian is the eastern part of Jerusalem, Jericho, Ramallah, Salfit, and all these other cities. So the city of Ramallah is located in Ramallah and Al-Bira governorates in here, again, very close to Jerusalem. But just like any other Palestinian city, the city is under a collection or a matrix of Israeli colonial tools of control and oppression to Palestinians. So the city of Ramallah is actually 3 cities. You could find Ramallah in here, Bitunia, and then to the right, Al-Bira, but there the 3 cities are expanded towards each other to, almost now they kind of form one urban fabric. So this is Palestinian, under the Palestinian government, under the Palestinian Authority. But then right next to it, all of those blue areas that you could see in here are actually classified as Area C. And what that means is that these areas are under the Israeli control. So what that means is that the Palestinian city cannot expand to these Area C areas, and it limits the urban life, the urban planning, the urban development of those Palestinian cities. We also, within those Areas C, we have those darker blue patches, such as Psagot, Kochav Yaakov in here, and others up here and down here, like Givat Ze'ev. Those are Israeli settlements, Israeli cities, it's Israeli Jewish communities. And then what you also see in here is the Israeli separation barrier to Israel. This is the security barrier. It's important to protect the state of Israel from the Palestinians, while to Palestinians, this is actually an apartheid wall. And in here, you could also use those little X's, circles within X in the middle. Those are checkpoints. Qalandia checkpoint that I mentioned earlier is actually in here. So this map becomes more like a summary to the state of every Palestinian city in the West Bank, and to the limits to the urban expansion of those cities. Yet at the same time, the city of Ramallah is very specific, because Ramallah is currently the seat of the Palestinian government, and it's home to over 70 government institutions, Palestinian government institutions. It is the place to be in Palestine. If you ever to visit Palestine, you should definitely go to Ramallah. It's a city that offers cultural, economic, political, and social lives, but it's also a city that offers an international exposure. So all the economy, all the international institutions, embassies, the seat of the Palestinian government, everything becomes centralized in Ramallah. So if you were to visit Ramallah today, you will actually be struck by the amount of construction that's happening in the city, whether it is residential, governmental, or even cultural and economic. This is the Palestinian Museum. It's actually further away from Ramallah, but it's still within this kind of like Ramallah urban area. And this is a national memorial for the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, and this is an economic development in the city. So a lot of, because of the kind of like urban life and mainly the construction boom that's happening in the city, Ramallah represents an odd case in the situation of Palestine. On one hand, it's an occupied city. On the other hand, it offers a sense of life that is tells that, you know what, the city is liberated, Palestine is liberated, and there's a lot of construction and development that's happening in the city. A lot of this construction particularly showed up in the city in the middle of the 90s, particularly after the peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And this peace agreement is called the Oslo Peace Agreement. So a lot of this construction has been referred to as the post-Oslo construction boom that has been happening in the city. The city has been growing ever since the peace agreement up until this day, to an extent that it has drew a lot of attention. A lot of scholars, journalists, even local people called it the de facto capital of Palestine. Palestinian scholars call it a bubble that is detached from other Palestinian cities. It's a villa in the middle of the jungle. It's a city that is offering a 5-star occupation, or it's a schizophrenic city, as in it's a city that is actually under occupation, but at the same time, it's a city that it's under occupation, but it's also a city that is offering a sense of a life that is, after the liberation of Palestine. So based on that, and because of the because of the concentration of the government institutions of the city has been largely called the administrative capital of Palestine, or a de facto capital of Palestine. And this is where I actually start my PhD, because I was very aware of the situation of Ramallah and all of the debates that has been taking place about the city. But then for my PhD, I kind of started to narrow it down a little bit. And I decided to choose this capital narrative about the city, that it's actually a de facto capital. And this is the main argument for my PhD. I chose to kind of understand this capital nature of Ramallah, if it is actually a capital. So I started my argument by actually positioning Ramallah in relation to Jerusalem. Now, in the context of Palestine, and for Palestinians, both as the local population, the Palestinian nation in Palestine, in diaspora, and even for the Palestinian government, the city of Jerusalem is the only possible Palestinian capital city. And to introduce any other city, not only Ramallah, but any other city as a potential capital, or even as a de facto capital, or as a temporary capital, becomes dangerous from a national perspective. It becomes nationally refused for Palestinians, and it goes deeply against the fundamental definition of Palestinian national identity. So to say that Ramallah is even a de facto capital it's completely not acceptable from a Palestinian perspective, because it has it's only Jerusalem. At the same time, as a result of the peace agreement, Palestinians are not allowed to establish any form of national political representation in the city of Jerusalem. So the Palestinian government cannot come and establish a ministry in the heart of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem remains under total Israeli control. And it's actually, according to the Israeli perspective, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the state of Israel. So it's actually the conflict of whose capital Jerusalem is, whether it's for Palestinians or for Israelis or for both, is actually one of the most complicated issues in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But it's very important here to focus on this issue that for Palestinians, Jerusalem is the only possible national capital, yet they remain completely cut off from the city. So ever since the establishment of the Palestinian government, the Palestinian government, or the Palestinian Authority, the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, has been placed in the West Bank temporarily until Jerusalem is liberated and that Palestinians are able to establish their government in Jerusalem. So the Palestinian government has been based in the West Bank, but particularly it has been concentrated in Ramallah, but all temporarily. And for us to understand this kind of physical manifestation of the government in Ramallah, I think we need to understand the administrative capital of the city. So the city was under the Israeli occupation until the peace agreement in 1995. In December 1995, the Israeli army pulled out of the city of Ramallah, and the Palestinian government arrived to the West Bank and Gaza and to the city of Ramallah. And ever since then, the Palestinian government kind of like was in control of the city of Ramallah. That was the case up until early 2000, particularly until the year 2004, when the former Palestinian President Yasser Arafat passed away, and we had the second intifada before that. And all of these political instabilities that happened in the region that eventually resulted in the year 2007 and 2008 into the establishment of the Palestine Reform and Development Plan by the Palestinian government, which was later followed by a state building program, a state building project. And what these two documents actually refer to or mean is that, in a nutshell, is that the Palestinian government decided to build the Palestinian state regardless of the occupation through introducing economic reforms and building state institutions. So what building state institutions means is that they wanted to build the capacity of the state institutions, but also build them as physical structures on the ground. So in that there was, for the first time, or not really for the first time, but mainly for the first time, there was the first time that the Palestinian government actually started building government institutions in the city of Ramallah. In what you see here in the picture, this is a compound of 7 key ministries with a multi-billion-dollar cost. This is the office for the Palestinian Prime Minister. This image in here is the same as this one that is actually being built. And this is the Palestinian presidential compound. So in that there was, all of these buildings in Ramallah and the West Bank in general, but a lot of them are concentrated in Ramallah, all of them are perceived by the government as to be temporary structures that are meant to house the government, the Palestinian government. And when Jerusalem is liberated, all of those institutions are supposed to be moved to Jerusalem, to the capital. So all what you see here in this slide is actually supposed to be temporary. And from an architectural point of view, we all know that this cannot be temporary. You cannot build in this scale and with this cost and with such an image and call this temporary. So there has been a lot of construction that is happening in the city, but the fact that these building institutions starting to emerge after the state building program, it drew even more attention to the city to an extent that even local Palestinians started questioning the status of Ramallah. Is Ramallah a capital? What happened to our national obligation to Jerusalem? Is Ramallah a temporary capital? What does it mean to have a temporary capital? This is, for example, an image here of a Palestinian holding a sign that reads in Arabic, Ramallah is not a capital. Those are graffiti on the walls in Ramallah that say Ramallah is not a capital, also in Arabic. There's even a hashtag in Arabic that went viral on social media, that Ramallah is not a capital. So there is this narrative that Ramallah is becoming a capital from journalists or visitors or academics, but also the local population started feeling that, you know what, are we building our state in Ramallah? Is Ramallah becoming a capital? And those are from the local people. So in that, people started questioning the temporary nature of those institutions in Ramallah. And this is where I decided to focus, and where I also start my own theoretical framework. I was interested in understanding the relationship between political power and architecture and urbanism, but particularly capital cities as well. You know, it's a lot of scholars try to understand this relationship, and I think we also for me, I felt that I need to position the Palestinian nation with other nation states from around the world. And if we look back at the history, we could see that a lot of the nation states actually emerged after the collapse of the British Empire and the French Empire. And it was after World War II that most of the nation states that we know today were actually formed. Nearly half of the approximately 200 states that exist today were actually formed after World War II. So the Palestinians are not really an exception to that. They are a nation that they want to establish their state. And the idea of having a state is so central and important. This is where it also it intersects. The idea of establishing a nation state intersects with architecture and urbanism, because the state is defined as a sovereign entity that extends its sovereignty over a defined territory. So the idea of having a territory, of having a land, of having a place to kind of build this state, to show your sovereignty to the world and to your nation becomes crucial and central. And actually works of architecture and urbanism are key part in this, idea of grounding the state in a territory. This is also the case for the capital cities. If we think about the capital city as a very specific form of city, it is meant to serve this idea of the state, to show the state's sovereignty, both to the people and to the world. And it's so important to an extent that it becomes impossible to think of a nation state that does not have a capital city, right? So it's meant to be this microcosm that represents the state and actually the nation. And if we think also about architecture and capital cities, it's almost, in most of the cases, there is a lot of thinking of how to design capital cities, what's the urban plan of a capital city, how to build government institutions, and all of that. And so this kind of like all of the state sovereignty becomes materialized in works of architecture and urbanism, usually on the borders, but also mainly in the capital city. And there's a lot of scholars who actually try to understand the relationship between power and architecture, particularly in the context of capital cities. Some of those scholars come from architecture, some of them come from urban planning, others come from political science. So it's an interdisciplinary area of research. But I think we all agree that that building state institutions becomes very symbolic and becomes very important for the realization and for the materialization of the nation state. So if we position Palestine within this larger literature, we see that whatever the government is building in Ramallah is actually comes from these desires to build a state, but also because Ramallah is not a capital, we can see Ramallah as a paradox. It should be considered temporary, but at the same time, it is the place where all of those government plans and the state building program is actually being materialized. So what does this mean in relation to Jerusalem and in relation to the larger national Palestinian project? So what I did is the first thing, in order to understand how Ramallah is actually materializing, I went back to the approaches of the Palestinian government when there was the peace agreement, but then they were not, as part of the peace agreement, they were not allowed to establish any national presence in Jerusalem. And so what the Palestinian government did at that time, or the Palestinian Authority, is that they had a strategy. They wanted to be as close as possible to Jerusalem, excuse me, They wanted to be as close as possible to Jerusalem. They wanted to decentralize Palestinian political institutions in different cities. And they decided not to build in most cases, and they decided to rent or reuse existing buildings and convert those into offices or into government buildings. One of the most important buildings that was built during the early years of the 90s is actually the Palestinian Parliament in Abu Dis. So if we look at this a map of Jerusalem in here, to strategy number one, to build to be as close as possible to Jerusalem. So most of the Palestinian government institutions during the early years were actually in the neighborhoods of Aram, Dahiyat al-Barid, and Abu Dis, which are just on the edges of Jerusalem. And in Abu Dis, what the government did is that they started building a Palestinian parliament. Their argument is that, you know what, once we get Jerusalem, the parliament would be already there. And it's so close to the old city of Jerusalem. If you look at the scale of this map, it's less than 5 kilometers away from the old city of Jerusalem. So it makes it like the ideal location to have a Palestinian parliament at the capital. So that was what they built in the from 1996, I think 1997. But if we look at Abu Dis is not fully under Palestinian control. It's within Area B in the West Bank, and that goes also back to the peace agreement. But it's a long story. But the point of this is that Abu Dis is not under full Palestinian control. And so when the parliament was under construction, you could see here the Israeli army standing here, observing the construction of the parliament. And it's actually, the parliament was never completed. It stands today as a half-finished building. And if we look at this map, this is the wall that Israel built. And this is what you see in here, this solid line is the border for the municipality of Jerusalem. And as you can see here, the building stands right, almost 2/3 of it is actually within the borders of Jerusalem, and this only little piece is actually within the Palestinian or within the West Bank. So 2/3 of the building is under Israel's control, and 1/3 is under Palestinian control. And so based on that, the Israeli authorities kind of like interrupted the construction of the building. They did not allow it to proceed. And actually, when they built the wall, they built it right at the edge of the parliament. It's called the Palestinian National Council building. So we could see that in every time, and this is just one case. So every time this is the building, have finished. Every time the Palestinian government tried to build as close as possible to Jerusalem, and to kind of like to address the fact that Jerusalem is at some point needs to be a Palestinian capital, it was interrupted by Israel, and Israel actually did not allow the project to proceed. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that because Ramallah was never chosen as a capital. Rather, the concentration of the political institutions that I'm going to show you in a second in the city of Ramallah is actually as a result of these constant Israeli attempts to prevent any sort of Palestinian national presence in the city of Jerusalem. So even when the Palestinians were in Ramallah, they started also establishing institutions in Ramallah. There was also the same logic that most of the institutions were actually to the southern part of the city. They rented offices in the southern part of the city. And the logic was that we want those to be as close as possible to Jerusalem. But then we had the Second Intifada, and then we had the state building program. And then suddenly, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian government is not renting anymore. It's actually building, and it's not building in the southern part of the city. It's actually building in different parts of the city. So there is this kind of shift from before the state building program to after the state building program. There's this shift in addressing the issue of Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital that seems to be materialized right in the construction of government institutions and the ways the government institution tried to materialize itself in space. So this is where kind of also my PhD research in terms of investigating the city also starts. So I started by mapping actually all the government institutions in the city. What you see in here is actually the map of Ramallah, and this is the city center in these two circles here. And all of those red buildings that you see are actually government institutions. This map was never done before because those buildings were built at different stages through the state building program. And not all of them are purpose-built. Some of them are still rented facilities, but then the majority of them are actually purpose-built. So I start by mapping them. And then after I map them and after different approaches and being aware of the history of the city and all of that, I started noticing that there's actually a pattern in here. This was not done in a random manner. What I figured out is that there is a cluster. There are two actually clusters in the city, what I call the northern cluster and the southern cluster. And if we add the street layer in here, this blue line that you see here is actually the main streets that runs from the northern side of the city to the south, and that runs right at the heart of the city. So from this, we could see that there's actually a sense of order, and there's a sense of planning, or at least a logic that emerges just by seeing those government institutions together on one map. And then I isolated the rest of the city, and from this, I tried to understand kind of like the spatial order of the city in relation to other capital cities around the world. And now, although those different cities, such as Ankara, London, Abuja, Washington, D.C., they have different social, cultural, and political conditions. And their urban layout is, of course, are different from each other, and they come from different historical periods. Nevertheless, we will be able to find a certain degree of order, of clustering, and a certain logic and connectivity that could be identified in each one of them. And in that, Ramallah is no exception. All of that could also be seen in Ramallah. And then what I did is that there is I zoomed in at each cluster and I tried to understand what's exactly in each one of them. But for the rest of this presentation today, I would like to zoom in at one which I think is one of the most important buildings, government institutions in the city of Ramallah. And that is it's this one in the northern cluster, this big compound that you see in here. It is actually the Muqata'a, which means it's actually the Palestinian presidential headquarters in Ramallah. This is where the president sits and where his office is and where he receives visitors and all of that. So Muqata'a is a compound, is almost 60,000 square meters in area. It's located in the northern government cluster. This is the main building of the Muqata'a. But what you see in here is actually inside the compound itself. If you're lucky enough to enter that compound, but what you will be able to see from the outside is actually this. The whole compound is surrounded by this wall, watchtowers, cameras, CCTV, and you could see the scale of the wall from these two women who are walking next to it. The Muqata'a, this is the whole complex as it sits in the city. The Muqata'a is an interesting complex, mainly because it's actually a colonial compound, or a colonial building. It was built by the British in early 1940s, and it was part of, this is how the Muqata'a, when it was built in the 1940s from the Israeli archives, it's actually, there was not only one Muqata'a, if you'd like to put it that way. The construction of the Muqata'a was part of a larger scheme by the British police to oppress the Palestinian revolution, which was in the 1930s. So what the British did is that they built police stations and detention centers all over the country. There's almost 60 or 70 of them. And some of them are still standing until today. Some of them were destroyed. Some of them are still standing and work as function as museums and different functions. But these were built as colonial structures and were meant to oppress the Palestinians and to oppress the local revolution. The Muqata'a in Ramallah, which if we see in here, this is the map of the British scheme. It was called Tegart Fortresses. And so the Muqata'a of Ramallah is actually here, which is currently the Palestinian presidential headquarters. So if we go back to the Muqata'a, we could see that it was actually built by the British, and then it was occupied by the Jordanians and then by the Israelis until the arrival of the Palestinian Authority in 1995. So during these years, it was mostly, the building was mostly associated with colonialism, imprisonment, and oppression. But then in the year 1995, the building became associated with victory and achievement, because it was the first time that you know what, we have a Palestinian government functioning in Palestine. That was the case until the year 2002, when the former Palestinian president Yasser Arafat was put under siege in the Muqata'a, and the Israeli army invaded the West Bank and the Muqata'a. As a result of that, 90% of the whole complex that you could see in here was actually destroyed. And Yasser Arafat was under siege for nearly 2 years inside the Muqata'a until he passed away. So the building became, after the year 2002 and after the Israeli invasion, became associated also with resistance and resilience, because in the resilience of the former Palestinian president, there was it's kind of like symbolized the resilience of all of the Palestinian people and their resistance to the Israeli occupation. So the building became to hold this kind of like national importance or national significance for the Palestinians. And what I also did is that I tried to kind of like track what happened to the complex. So this is when it was built by the British, and then little additions by the Palestinian Authority in 1997, and then destruction. That was the case until 2006. And then after the state building program, the Muqata'a was completely reconstructed. And Yasser Arafat was actually buried inside the Muqata'a. So what you see in here, all of this is actually the result of the Palestinian reconstruction of the site. This was done by Palestinian decisions and by Palestinian money. So today the Muqata'a is, as I said, it's the functioning place for the Palestinian presidency. The office of the president is there. This is how it looks from the inside. You could see this is a completely new built structure. This is remains from the Israeli siege, and this is also a built structure inside the Muqata'a. Now, for the burial of Yasser Arafat, what gets important in here is that Yasser Arafat was buried in the site, as you could see in here. This yellow portion is actually the Yasser Arafat Memorial Site, and it consists of the tomb of Yasser Arafat under this mausoleum, which you can see here as point B on the map in here, and the mosque and a mosque and a museum. The museum was meant to be for Yasser Arafat, but then it developed to tell the narrative of the Palestinian people. And it's currently called the Museum of the Palestinian National Identity, Contemporary Palestinian National Identity. The museum consists of ramps that you could go on, and if you start from down here and then you go up, and it tells you the history of the Palestinian people from the early 20th century up until the death of Yasser Arafat. And then there is a little portion of the museum that it actually connects to where Yasser Arafat was under siege. This is Yasser Arafat's office to the left. You can see Yasser Arafat's office, his regular office, and to the right you can see his office when he was under siege. Those are not replicas, those are the actual offices of Yasser Arafat. And then the whole visit of the site ends with Yasser Arafat's bedroom under siege. So you enter this memorial site, you visit Yasser Arafat's tomb, and then you go to the museum. You're being shown the history of the Palestinian people, and then the whole visit ends up with the bedroom of Yasser Arafat when he was under siege. So for my argument, the way I understand the Muqata'a today as both as a place for the Palestinian president, but also as a place that where Yasser Arafat is buried, and there is this museum. No, this museum is actually was built by Palestinian money, by the government. The whole decision-making process was solely by the government, and it was even the narrative of the museum is actually the narrative of the Palestinian government. That does not necessarily represent all of the Palestinians. And today, Yasser Arafat Memorial Site is being used, which it's inside the Muqata'a. It has been used as a place to perform state theatrics, as it's the theatrics of the state is actually a term that was coined by political scientist Michel Pace. And it was a book by two scholars, Michel Pace and another scholar, excuse me, I forgot his name. But the book was about the establishing the theatrics of the Palestinian state in particular. And the way I try to understand the Muqata'a, and particularly the Yasser Arafat Memorial Site, is that it's a place to perform this state activities. So this is the Palestinian, this is the president of Malta coming to visit Yasser Arafat tomb, and this is the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas laying a wreath during the first day of Eid on Yasser Arafat tomb as well. And this is actually the mausoleum, and this is actually the night the museum was open to the public in 2016. And all of those are high-profile state people that flew specifically for this event from different countries around the world to open the museum. So the fact that the way I interpret all of this, being also aware of the context of Ramallah, is that Yasser Arafat Memorial Site, museum, the Muqata'a, but also the whole city is actually taking it's actually transforming Ramallah into a capital. And we could see all of those different activities that are taking place in the city are meant to display a sense of Palestinian statehood in Ramallah, but not in the city of Jerusalem. This is, for example, the entrance to the Yasser Arafat Memorial Site when it was built in the top picture, and then when it was also, I think, renovated a few years later. And it's important to note here that this site and the museum are free to visit, and they are open to the public. This is the only portion of the Muqata'a that's open to the general public. Yet very few people actually know about it because they think of it as being part of the Muqata'a and the state apparatus. So no one actually dares to go and actually try to go inside and visit the museum and Yasser Arafat tomb unless they actually know that it's safe to do so. Because the image it displays to the public from here, just from the entrance, it displays this image that this is actually part of the presidency institution, and it's completely shut to the public. And when I was there conducting fieldwork, you know, and just talking to the people, one of the visitors, for example, said, Arafat's memorial sites gives me a sense of pride, but it also evokes sad feelings. I feel very sorry for our situation now. History simply repeats itself, and we, as the Palestinians, are still stuck where we are. And so if we look at Ramallah and look at the Muqata'a, we could see that, you know, what Ramallah was meant to be a government base waiting to be transferred to Jerusalem, but the Muqata'a is also a temporary headquarter. Oh, I'm sorry, and I forgot to mention that Yasser Arafat is buried there also temporarily and until he is transferred to Jerusalem. There's a heavy investment in the government institutions in the city, but also there is a lot of expensive reconstruction of the Muqata'a and of the Yasser Arafat memorial site. And the city of Ramallah reflects this image of a state in the making, which actually being performed and taking place through those government institutions, but also through the Muqata'a and the Yasser Arafat memorial site and Arafat's legacy. So the conclusion to all of this, and this is 2 slides left, that's it. I think this is the last slide, that Ramallah does indeed become a capital. This is my conclusion. It has the look and the feel of a capital city, yet we need to understand that this is an extremely paradoxical capital, and we need to understand that the Palestinians tried to establish their state in Jerusalem, and every time they were cut off by Israel. And we need to also understand that Ramallah, the way I see Ramallah is that it's not detached from the rest of the Palestinian reality. I don't see it as a bubble. The way I see it is that I see it in relation to Jerusalem. And the way I interpret all of this is that the more that Ramallah actually grows, the more that we're able to see through all of this construction that there is a sense of loss to Jerusalem, that whatever the Palestinians cannot establish in Jerusalem is actually being established in Ramallah. So yes, it is a capital, but then we need to be very aware of this particularly very sensitive capital city and what it means and actually how it emerged. So that's it from my side. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and yeah, hope that was not boring. I've been talking for like 55 minutes. So I'll stop now.
Boring at all. I feel like you could have been continued with the presentation. You would have been, you know, capturing us. I wanted to thank Anwar for her really great lecture, and I wanted to also open up the floor to the questions from the audience. So let's start. Let's see if we have any questions, and if you do, feel free to either turn on your camera, raise your hand, or if you don't feel like doing that, you can also type the question in the chat, and I will read it out for you. We have just a few comments, maybe before the questions start coming in. Hella is saying fascinating, thank you so much. And Michelle is saying definitely it's in a bubble, but I think this is an earlier comment referring to Ramallah. So once again, I wanted to see if, do we have any questions from the audience?
I do have a question to Anwar.
Yes, Claudia.
Yeah, if you don't mind telling us maybe a little bit more about yourself. I'm sorry, I'm always inquiring into personal details with the people we work with, because I think it's really important also to understand like the personal history, also personal context. So I was just curious, and I hope you didn't mention in your presentation, but when did you leave Ramallah, and how was your experience? How is your experience abroad? How do you look at Ramallah from the West, your position as a as a
Right. Yeah, I think this is a very important question. It also brings in methodological issues and the question of my own positionality. So I've been asked a lot about my positionality as a Palestinian myself, studying an extremely sensitive context in Palestine itself. And my answer to that is that from a methodological perspective, I follow an interpretive approach. And for those of you who are not aware of what interpretive research is, it's basically an approach to research where you don't approach your research with a predefined hypothesis. You rather try to make sense of the phenomena in front of you. So, and this is exactly my situation. I was very aware of the situation in Ramallah, having coming from there, but also doing architecture on the edges of Ramallah. At Birzeit, most of our projects were actually in Ramallah. So I was aware of the administrative structure of the city in terms of like urban planning and architecture and all of that. But I also studied there at a very particular time, which is from 2008 to 2013. And this is exactly the beginning of the state building project. So as I was studying there, in Birzeit itself, as we were doing architecture, we were studying architecture, there has been a lot of debates about the city, like what's happening to Ramallah, who's building in Ramallah, what is the image of Ramallah. And so I kind of like, I absorbed that, I guess. But I was also able to observe the changes of the city from the day I studied to the day I graduated, and even when I left to Cambridge for my master's and my PhD. Every time I used to come back and observe more and more changes of the city. In interpretive research as well, the approach refuses that the researcher needs to get to the research subject as blank slates, right? I personally always encourage my students to address their connection to a particular research topic that they want to study. There is something that interests each and one of us for a reason. And that's what gets us interested in conducting the kind of research that we do. And I don't believe that we should, shy away from these personal connections and say, you know what, no, I'm approaching this as a researcher. No, my approach is that I'm approaching this as a scholar, as a researcher, as an academic, as a professor, as a postdoc, but also I am Palestinian. And this is very important because I'm seeing this from a Palestinian perspective. This research deals with Palestinian affairs. Those are Palestinian decisions that were taken in Ramallah that decided to build the city. And the fact that I come from there really helped me on so many levels, but mainly in accessing the field, because during my field work, I never went out, asking people, hey, what do you think of Ramallah becoming a capital, right? It's an extremely sensitive topic. So I needed to get people's trust, to trust me and to open up and to actually talk. And the fact that I come from there really helped in that. So, there was, once someone asked me a question like, don't you think you're biased? And I don't think I am biased because, again, because I follow this interpretive approach, and which is an approach that recognizes the positionality of the researcher and their role in conducting the research. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anwar. We have 2 more questions from the audience. So I will pass the mic on to Hella. I think raise your hand first, and then we have Susie as well afterwards. So Hella, please.
Hi, thank you very much. This might be a big question, and maybe there's just one example that you can give, but I wonder if there's something about the aesthetics of the buildings you were looking at, and specifically that kind of signal or because I don't know too much about the architecture in this region, but I know there definitely wasn't any like international style, nothing that might remind you of the Israeli architectural. So I wonder if that factored into your research, if there was some subliminal messaging with style, typology.
Right. In terms of style, I mean, as you saw, these are not the perfect buildings, right? Like these are not the most well-designed buildings in the world. And obviously there isn't, I would say there isn't a lot of thinking. They were meant to be functional buildings, right? And I do have the plans of some of those buildings. Like it's nothing more than corridors and rooms, and that's it. But there has been a great emphasis on the scale and on the outer image, and it's actually their isolation from the rest of the city. Now, in terms of, I think your question becomes important if we talk about style, but also regional connection. I wouldn't connect them to Israeli buildings. I would connect them rather to buildings, to other government buildings, mainly I would say Jordan, or I would say also like a lot of government institutions in the region, Arab government institutions in the region look, I would say, very similar. But the ones that I looked at are actually in Ramallah, and I do have, in Amman, in Jordan. And when I traced particularly the architects, those were, for example, that government compound that had 7 ministries, that rendered image that I showed, that was a local architectural firm based in Nablus. And then the Yasser Arafat Memorial Site is actually an architectural firm. It was designed by an architectural firm in Amman, in Jordan, by a Palestinian Jordanian architect. His name is Jafar Tuqan. Jafar Tuqan is very known in the region. Interesting enough, though, Jafar Tuqan is the same person who designed the parliament in the 90s. Right? So you could see these dynamics here, and this kind of like coalition between the architect and the government. So Jafar Tuqan becomes like the architect of the Palestinian government, and he designed different projects in different periods. And there's actually a memorial for Mahmoud Darwish, the international Palestinian poet, is very famous, and his memorial site was also designed by Jafar Tuqan. Now, these 2 memorial sites, which I also talk about in my research, were funded by the Palestinian government, and the decision-making dynamics was also solely by the government. So you could see these regional, this regional, if we're talking about a style, you could see this regional style emerging in tracking these different connections.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe you can move on to Susie's question. Susie, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks so much for your excellent talk. It's really nice to hear about your research. Can you say a little bit about the role of speculative urban development and real estate-driven capitalism and the kind of politics of making Ramallah the de facto capital and keeping it in that position?
You mean all of those other projects that are emerging in the city, like the real estate and economic development and all of that? Yeah, actually, Rawabi was during the early stage of my research, Rawabi was part of my research, but then I decided to kind of like exclude it. But if you're if you look at every single piece of research that has been done on Ramallah, it exactly talks about this. It talks about the neoliberal approach of the government in its estate building program, and the realization of all these different projects such as Rawabi, Ersal Street, and all these other projects. Now, the way, when I started my research, I wanted to include all of that, but then there is, you cannot include everything, right? So I decided to focus on this particular government institutions and build on it. However, the way I see it is that Ramallah is not an exception. Like, you could see all of these other neoliberal capitalist projects in other parts of the West Bank, right? You could see them in Bethlehem, in Jericho, in Jenin, and in different other cities. And there are government institutions in those cities as well. However, Ramallah is very unique because it's the only place that you could find this heavy concentration of government institutions. And my interpretation of this is that the fact that the government is there attracted all of those other developments to come in the city. The way I see it is that it all goes back to the government. And I don't know, maybe because people would feel that they are safe being next to the government, but also Ramallah is, and Susie, I know who you are, so I know that you're aware of the context of Palestine, but Ramallah is area A, and so it makes it, and it's close to Jerusalem, but at the same time, it's kind of like the only city that was not shut during the Second Intifada. And kind of like Israel is allowing all of that to happen in Ramallah, I would say for a reason. This was not done randomly. There is a direction from Israel to direct the Palestinian government or the Palestinians to be in Ramallah. They are allowing that and facilitating it. But then again, at the same time, what's being built is actually being built by Palestinian decisions. And in the case of those other developments, mainly by Palestinian money as well. So it's part of it. But it's not my area of research.
Thanks so much. Great to hear your thoughts on it.
Thanks, Susie. Thank you for the question. We have another question from Mirna. Mirna, the floor is yours.
Hello, hi, thank you. Thanks very much, Anwar. I'm very happy to hear more about Palestine. I was wondering, I do apologize for this kind of half-baked question that's going to come out, and it's going to be something rather speculative that I will kind of ask you to sort of give me your opinion on. But I was thinking about the recent events in Palestine, let's say from earlier this year, the events in Sheikh Jarrah, everything that's been happening kind of across the cities in all, like under not just Palestinian territories, but I was thinking more like Palestinian communities in Israeli cities. And I was wondering, this kind of new sort of reframing almost of Palestinian geography back to kind of inclusion of all those lost territories since the Nakba and kind of very early 1948 on this kind of idea of Palestine from river to the sea. Do you see these kind of things reverberating somehow back into kind of how Ramallah is going to sort of develop in the future? Do you think that there is the younger kind of generations now, particularly of Palestinians living in Israeli cities, who are now kind of reclaiming their Palestinian identity once again? Do you see that somehow that might be sort of a new kind of grassroots wave that might somehow reframe the current situation? I know this is like me projecting really far into the future, but I was just kind of based on, like, obviously you're very much kind of in the thick of it, and through research there might be some ideas perhaps that this, is there a possibility for this, or how it might materialize? Sorry.
No, I'll try to answer your question both in my capacity as a scholar but also as a local Palestinian who grew up in Jerusalem. This is very important. Yeah. Okay, so see, when I was doing my fieldwork in Ramallah and asking people about the spatial transformation of the city and how, you know, that there is emerging narrative that Ramallah is a capital and all of that, there's this counter argument that, you know what, we are building in Palestine. Yes, we're not building in the capital, and Ramallah will never be a capital, but Ramallah is part of Palestine. And we don't want to keep waiting for the occupation to go away. We want to build in Palestine. This is Palestinian soil, and we were building there. And, you know, there is actually one of my interviewees said, you know, building is existing. So we build, therefore we exist, therefore we build, or we build, therefore we exist, sorry. So, and I agree with that, definitely. I mean, this is Palestinian land, and see, it's not about right or wrong. It's rather about the way it's being framed, right? And the way it's being displayed. And I would say that, you know, like if you follow what Palestinian officials say about all of those constructions in the city, they would go like, no, this is all temporary, and we would go to Jerusalem, and then we could reuse these buildings for whatever. Now, again, from architectural point of view, it's not that easy to do that. Like there's even not a consideration for another use in the design of those buildings, but it's a valid argument, right? And this is the way that they decided to build Palestine. And that's why they also, maybe this also brings back Susie's question about all of those other developments in the city. The state building program included economic reforms that allowed all of those other residential and economic developments to take place in the city. And this is also a form of state building, right? Although it's not government institutions. So I really don't have an answer in the sense that, you know, is this right or is this wrong? I think every Palestinian has their own interpretation of the situation. But my research was mainly concerned with the government's approach. Now, and I think also myself as a Palestinian who grew up in Jerusalem, I grew up in this gray zone where I'm not affiliated with Israel, but also I'm not affiliated with the Palestinian government. Because, you know, I don't hold a Palestinian passport or Palestinian ID or any form of that. And I'm not Israeli as well. I'm kind of like, I grew up in this very specific in-between zone. That I think in my research was also important because at some point I was able to position myself in and out as a Palestinian. But also when I think about this, like I would say personally, I'm happy to see people building and constructing and people living. And that was also reflected in the interviews that I conducted. That people actually one of the people that I interviewed told me, like, we don't want to be the victims all the time. Like, we want to build, we want to show the world that, you know, there is a shiny image of Palestine. Now, whether he referred to the government institutions or to these all other developments, I don't know. But I think it's a valid argument, and people have the right to think that way if they want to think that way. I don't know, I hope it answers your question somehow.
No, thank you so much. It's just, I mean, yeah, sorry for, like I said, it's a half-baked question. I know it's a very speculative one, but I was just kind of interested to hear your thoughts about, like, you know, the kind of the juxtaposition between the kind of current situation, the development, and the, you know, the research that you were working on. But thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Midna, for the question. We have another question from Hiba. Hiba, please, the floor is yours. Okay, so Hiba, if you change your mind, you can ask a question. We have another question in the chat, so I'm just going to read it out loud. Hiba says, I cannot unmute. So maybe if you would like, you can type your question and I will read it out loud after, I think we have Michael's question. He says, thank you for your presentation and for speaking in English. It looks like the Ramallah state building architecture is becoming a kind of sovereignty. And it sounds as if this is not entirely accepted by Palestinians. Do you think this forward thinking to just accept this and move ahead?
I think there is again, there might be, see, when I was conducting my research, I was able to find some sources that I think it was a research paper that was talking about the early days of the Oslo Agreement and the relationship between Jerusalem and Ramallah. And I think one Israeli official said, I think, in the early 90s, in that paper, they do mention, the author mentions that Israeli official said, why not give Ramallah to the Palestinians to establish their capital? Because it's so close to Jerusalem and it sounds so convenient. But that was early in the 90s. So there's nothing written in Israeli sources that would say, you know what, to let the Palestinians build their capital in Ramallah. But there is also this logic of creating facts on the ground that Ramallah has the infrastructure to function as a capital. But again, you know, and this is where the positionality of the researcher becomes important, in a sense that even if you create those facts on the ground, if you do really understand what it means to be Palestinian and the significance of Jerusalem to Palestinians, I don't think that Ramallah will ever function as an alternative to Jerusalem. It might be, in a sense, of a fact on the ground, in a sense that it's a strategy to allow the Palestinian have a sense of statehood while not having Jerusalem, to allow them to practice what it means to have a state. But if you really think on the longer term, and if you really think, if we really consider any sort of political initiative that tries to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that does not address Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital, I think people like I think none of that would work. And you know, there was also, when the Palestinians were building the parliament in Abu Dis, it was actually the same logic, that they were also trying to create facts on the ground on the edges of Jerusalem in order to pressure Israel to accept Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital. But then again, given the Israeli approach to Jerusalem, they did everything possible to shut the Palestinians from that. So the facts on the grounds work, but then in that specific case of Ramallah and Jerusalem and the issue of a capital city, I think even if you create facts on the ground in Ramallah, I don't think the Palestinians will ever accept it.
Fair enough. Thank you, Anwar, for the answer. We have two questions from Hiba typed in the chat. So I will start with the first question. She says, I already asked you this in a previous lecture, and I'm not sure if someone already asked this, but have you had a chance to look at the similarities in colonial practices in using architecture in oppressing groups, specifically the USA and Black people, and Canada with indigenous populations, reservations, and residential schools?
Okay, so I'm still working on this, Hiba, actually. I'm trying to get myself to understand what it means to be a Palestinian that is now a settler in Canada. I'm kind of like on the other side of the coin, right? I was the oppressed, and I'm sort of like the settler now in Canada. But also, I think if you take the settler colonialism lens, there is already a lot of work that has been done, bringing together Israel, Palestine, Australia, Canada, and the US. From architecture specifically, that's what I'm working on right now. I'm trying to kind of like root it more in architecture and try to understand it. I think there's another question.
Yes. So the second question is, have you looked at how Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan build their camps? Maybe it is not very possible because in camps there is no planning and building permits are limited by the government. But can you speak to the architecture of the camps?
Again, it's not my area of research, but of course I'm aware of the scholars and their kind of work. They talk to about the camps. I think the Palestinian camps are very unique because the Palestinian refugees are actually amongst I think they are the biggest. There was a source actually that was talking about this. They are the oldest refugees group in the world. And then when you talk about camps, Palestinian camps, when you talk about camps in general, the camp as a tool for oppression, historically, it has been very fascinating because it goes back to colonial roots in South Africa. And it's actually a colonial tool that was then again used by the colonizer again in Europe. And if you think about our life now post 9/11 and the war of terrorism that was initiated by the Bush administration, the camp and detention camps like Guantanamo, for example, is also emerging back again in the area of research to an extent that now we have a whole discipline called camp studies that tries to understand the camp as a unit of study going back to colonial times up until even now the current migration refugees movement in Europe and the kind of different camps that they make in Europe. So I think we need to position the Palestinian camps within that. But again, back to the very specific Palestinian case, it goes case by case where that camp is regarding building permits and all of that, and the role of the UN. But it's also they do symbolize the resistance of the Palestinians and their resilience. And a lot of other scholars talked about that. I can direct you to different sources, but I think this is what I could say in terms of camps.
Fair enough. Thank you, Anwar. Just a few more comments, not really questions. Roseanne says, thank you so much. Well done, so proud of you. Michelle says, thank you for the presentation. I apologize, but she had to leave early. And before that, she says, in regards to the bubble, I saw it as that it seems so far removed from how the majority of the Palestinian people live. I think she was in her position when she said she was referring to Ramallah as the bubble.
Yeah, this is definitely the same framing that other scholars use, and I also see it that way as well, if we consider the way of living and aspirations and all of that. But then if we also think about Palestinians as people who also want to live just like any other people, it may not be so bubbled, right? And especially if we put the Palestinians within the regional context of other nearby countries as well.
One more message coming in. There is a question from Michael too. I think I've read that one about the forward thinking to accept and move ahead. Is that one? Yes, we answered that one. And I think that's it for the questions. I'm going to refrain. I think it's getting kind of late in the evening, Anwar. So I'm going to refrain from asking you questions here. and I'm going to leave this conversation. Hopefully, we will continue our collaboration, and maybe I can keep in touch within emails. I do have some questions, but I'm afraid it's going to get long-winded for now because it is 8:23 here local time. And so I would like to wrap up if everyone agrees. I think that would be okay. So thank you, Anwar. Yeah. Thank you, Anwar, so much for tonight. Thank you for sharing this insight about Ramallah. Next week we continue our talks with Sabina Tanovic and Alessandra and Abed from the Yellow Project, who are actually heading a local NGO. They're architects and practicing architects and also teaching at the university. So it's going to be another interesting conversation, 2 interesting conversations next week. So please do join us. And that's it for tonight. Again, we thank our guest Anwar for being with us tonight. First time at Kuma, definitely not the last. So thank you, Anwar, for taking the time for being with us, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Anwar, on my behalf as well. It's been a very fascinating lecture. Thank you so much for accepting Kuma's invitation. And thank you so much, as usual, to the people that are joining these online conversations. It's really great to see many people joining and asking very interesting questions. I love the discussions, always following the talk. So it's really, really, really great. And it's a pleasure to spend these evenings with you. And Anwar, we wait for you in Sarajevo, hopefully sometime soon.
Hopefully soon. Thank you so much. Yeah, hopefully.
Before that would be even better. Then we come to see in Ramallah one day.
Exactly. Yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Have a good night.
See you next week. Hopefully.
Bye.
Thank you. And thank you, Leila, as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.